All right, this is the third in the Rosetta Stone of Psychology series, and this one is primarily about consciousness. And first off, these are all of the different subjects that are being discussed and presented within this series. And it's actually not complete. Evolution is being considered and other areas. In fact, in today's, we'll get into a little history, seafaring history. But overall, the idea is that these things are all integrated, and the model underneath it all, emotive energy, is a Rosetta Stone, which can be used to translate from one subject area to another. All of these various systems identified here can be integrated together through the emotive energy model. All right, in the past, talked about physics a little bit in the first series, and then we talked about humanism, and that included Maslow's pecking order, and then we hit behaviorism and B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. And we got into control systems, which is part of control or perceptual control theory, William T. Powers. And along the way, we hit upon neuroscience. And then we're left with emotions and conscious and subconscious systems. So we'll do that today. And it starts off actually with neuroscience. In the past, we talked a bit about parasympathetic nervous system, and that is the system that keeps us internally in balance and all of our organs and so forth working harmoniously together. So rather than call it the parasympathetic nervous system, I prefer to call it the internal control system, or the ICS for short. And that's balanced. Everything is working beautifully together. Now, the other major system of the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic nervous system. This is imbalanced. It's stressful, and we talked about that in the last part of this last one of the series, number 2. And basically, it indicates that if we're under stress, that it can be fatal. It can kill us. Because it's stressful and because it relates to what's going on outside of our bodies, I prefer the term external control system. So these are two major systems for the emotive energy model. And I presented this information back in 2009 at a conference in San Rafael, California. So internal control system and external control system are the terms I prefer. Now, the internal control system handles things like breathing, digestion, your heart beating, and your mind, your conscious mind, does not get involved. You don't tell your stomach to squish, squeeze, squish, squeeze. You don't tell your heart to beat or your lungs to breathe. So these are all basically auto magic, as I refer to them. And it's all handled by the internal control system. Now, for the external control system, these are things like your five senses: touch, taste, smell, vision, hearing. With these senses, you sample the external world. You sample the air with smell. You sample the noise with your ears. You sample what you can see with your eyes, what you can touch with your hands. These are sampling of the outside world. These are all part of the external control system. And it turns out the consciousness is part of the control system. All of these things that are your senses are integrated within consciousness. And there are questions, well, what are you seeing, or what are you hearing, or what are you touching? These are all relating to consciousness, because you're going to respond to those questions with sentences, and they're going to relate to your five senses. So consciousness is part of the external control system. And it's also a defense system. The external world is a dangerous place. So consciousness and the external control system are all directly tied together. All right. Now, the scientific terms parasympathetic nervous system, you also hear rest and digest related to that. And consciousness, external control system, again, it's the sympathetic nervous system. You'll hear the term fight or flight. So these are terms you're also going to hear. And because we like to rest and digest food, these are things we need to do, and we want to do them. They're considered positive in the emotive energy system, and they're marked in green. And this is sort of a spotlight, or actually more like a traffic light. Go on the green and stop on the red. Well, the red area are things that we don't like, we try to avoid. And in the middle, no, I don't have it yellow, it's marked in black as an area where things are neither positive or negative. They're sort of boring and we don't care about them. So they're registered on the scale as well. And in the second of the series of the Rosetta Stone, it relates to the neutral area in operant conditioning of B.F. Skinner. Now, the last system that directly relates to these two is the somatic nervous system. Now, in the last uh, presentation, number 2 of Rosetta Stone, I referred to this as the gas pedal. Now, if you go after something you want, you need, such as the things in the parasympathetic nervous system or the internal control system, as I refer to it, like you want food and you go after it, food, water, and breathing, you'll spend your resources, you'll spend your energy to obtain these. Similarly, for the sympathetic nervous system, the external control system, the consciousness that is involved with the dangers that you're avoiding in the external world, these also use energy from the somatic nervous system. Again, it's the gas pedal. So both of these systems use the gas pedal. Now, being positive and negative is not just something for emotive energy. This was presented by Victor S. Johnston down below, his book, Why We Feel. He also referred to our wants and needs in terms of positive and negative, just as marked in the emotive energy. He said that emotions as well as effects, that they come in two different hedonic tones. He calls them hedonic tones, positive and negative. Now, as far as the somatic nervous system, the gas pedal, this was referenced by Antonio Damasio in his book, The Feeling of What Happens. And he says the emotion is integral to the process of reasoning. And those who lost a certain class of emotions lost their ability to think rationally. And this system that he has is called his somatic marker hypothesis. And both of these researchers, Johnston and Damasio, are important because their ideas and the emotive energy model all address the same ideas. and they relate to consciousness, and they indicate ways that we mark ideas. And from the way we mark ideas, we make decisions. And so that's the next step. Now, within the emotive energy model, there are the two wedges that I use to describe Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the needs are on the left wedge. We need life above all else, but we need resources. The gold column, we need other people in our lives. The yellow column, we need confidence in what we're doing, which is the green column. And the last column, which is very short, is our star power, what separates us from other people. What are we really good at? And those are all positive. And for everything that we seek, all of these needs that Maslow identified, we try to avoid the opposite. We want life, we avoid death. We want resources like money. We don't want to be poverty stricken without resources. We want people in our lives. That's the heart. We don't want our heart to be broken. We don't want to be alone. And then we want our confidence to go up and not down. We want to be unique and special in the world, and we don't want to be a statistic. So these two wedges correlate with each other. And with these wedges, they take command of our thinking based on a competition of neurons. And we talked about neurons in the last presentation, number 2. And Christof Koch, a neuroscientist, said that any idea corresponds to a coalition of neurons. It's a group of neurons working together. And it's clear that a winner-take-all competition plays a key role in making decisions. That comes from his book, The Quest for Consciousness. Okay, so each one of these columns has a power level. It's a pecking order. The taller the column, the stronger the power. So the need for life supersedes the need for resources and money. And goes for fear as well. The fear of death is more important than the fear of running out of resources. And in the emotive energy diagram, these wedges are replaced by curves. The wedge on the left, which is positive resource or positive needs, they get replaced by a green line, which is curved. Similarly, the wedge on the right, which are things we try to avoid, it's replaced by a red line. So the internal control system has the green line, external control system, fear, it's the red line. And the gold area relates to the somatic nervous system. That's the gas pedal. All right. Now, one other thing is we are pressured by evolution to conserve resources. And the somatic nervous system, our gas pedal, we don't want to use our energy, whether it be time, sweat, or money, or whatever resources we're talking about. We don't want to waste those. Evolution is forcing us to conserve and use our resources efficiently. And that goes for our conscious decisions. All right. So the pressure is there, but the wedges of Maslow are embedded there, even though I'm using these curved lines. Don't forget that they're representing these wedges. So on the left, the most important thing is we need food. They're physiological needs. And that, again, is for the internal control system. And then on the right, these are things we don't want. We don't want to drink polluted water filled with germs and toxins and so forth. So we want to avoid that, which can cause illness and death. So starting from that, which represents these two, the internal control system, external control system, and the value scale, let's move forward on making decisions. So looking at the wedges, those are the familiar ideas presented at the top. That's life, the need for life. It's more important than anything else. And at the bottom, it's avoiding death. So that corresponds to the need for life. And then the gold column is resources, which we usually register in terms of money. And the heart is for people in our life. The green area, our confidence, we want it to go up and not down. And then our star power, what makes us unique and special in the world. And the counterpart in the red area is becoming a statistic, a nameless and meaningless statistic. And of course, in the middle, these are things that we don't care about. It's our neutral value. All right. Now, all of these have an energy power. And again, we need to use energy efficiently. And these also have an emotion. The things we want, we are emotional about. We definitely want life. We need resources. We want to avoid death. We want to avoid being impoverished. So there are emotions evolved with these things that we want and don't want. And these have an energy power. So emotions are directly related to this want line, if you want to call it, from high need and desire to low need or opposite needs and avoidance. Now, again, this all relates to the external control system and consciousness. That's what these systems and making decisions are all about. When you're asleep, your conscious mind does not get involved. The internal control system handles all of that automatically, but we get our minds involved when we are working with the external world. So this is emotions are related to our working with the external world, and cruising speed is sort of a middle point for emotions. It's a low level of energy, and it's basically our default. But there are things that we want which are stronger than cruising speed, and so they can take control. And of course, there are things that we don't want also, and these are stronger than cruising speed. So if anything comes into our perception, something we hear, like a lion's roar or a thunder strike, things that we need to be wary of, then it will overcome cruising speed emotionally, and we can suddenly enact behaviors related to that. All right. For a good example, this ship depicted from a painting is the wreck of the Central America. Central America was a ship called a packet ship, which means it was kind of like a bus service. And it went from Central America up to New York. There was another packet that went from San Francisco down to Central America. And I'm not sure what these folks had been on, but the year was 1857. And at that point in time, San Francisco was creating money from the gold that was dug out of the earth in California during the gold rush. And it was coined there. And this was a major shipment being sent back to New York, and it had to go by ship, which was the fastest route back in those days. The railroads had not crossed the great western stretches of the United States. And so the gold was shipped down to Central America and then ported across to the Atlantic side and put on a ship like the SS Central America, which then left for New York. And a lot of people going back to the States, they carried their own gold with them that often they would have it in trunks in storage on the ship. But many of them also had the coins in their money belts. They carried money belts. And for those who are not aware, gold is extremely heavy. Now, scuba divers, when we go into the ocean, we carry lead weights on a belt around our waist to help us to sink, because normally we would float, especially with tanks filled with air. It would just make us more buoyant. So we need to keep us somehow brought down, and we have to balance how much weight we're carrying with the amount of buoyancy caused by our bodies and especially our tanks filled with air. And as a result, uh, lead is considered one of the heaviest objects around. And it turns out that lead is very close in weight to gold. So gold is extremely heavy. And these passengers with money belts filled with gold coins, that was not very useful if you're trying to survive the sinking of your ship. So that was the dilemma. These people on board the SS Central America had to make a very dire and desperate decision. So what was going on? Well, money is and gold, these are resources, and there's certainly a lot of power to money. It's a powerful idea, powerful in motivation. But the alternative with the ship sinking was death. That was also very powerful and motivating. And when those two ideas were competed against each other, these people, at least the ones that survived, took their money belts off of their bodies and threw them over into the ocean, because they knew they wouldn't be able to swim with this heavy belt of gold strapped onto them. So those that did not take their belts off probably did not get survived unless they were in a lifeboat. For the others who did remove their belt, they had at least hope of surviving. So that was an example of two competing ideas. The idea, the powerful idea of wealth, money, versus the even more powerful idea of death from drowning. So those were the ideas competing against each other, and death was more important idea, avoiding death, than hanging on to their goal. So that's an extreme case, but that's how decisions are made. All right. Every experience that you have gets stored into your memory, every conscious experience. And they are marked with an emotional rating. And mentioned Antonio Damasio earlier. He called his the somatic marker, related to the somatic nervous system, the gas pedal. And Victor S. Johnston mentioned earlier, he called it a hedonic tone. And so both of these guys have a reference, which actually reference the emotional content. And within emotive energy, that's called the emotive trace. Now, despite the difference in the names, each of these is basically an emotional rating of importance to us. How important is it that we seek it, or how important it is to avoid it? And things in the middle, cruising speed, are sort of these things are banal and we ignore them. So there's an emotional rating, and effectively the somatic marker, emotive trace, and hedonic tones are all emotional ratings. And the rating, as it turns out, the model emotive energy says that the rating is how much less than ecstasy. Now, that seems pretty strange, but it relates to how the brain works. First of all, there are two types of memories, basically. There are episodic memories. These are like a movie, it's a story. And the other are semantic. And semantic memories are basically objects, things. Like, is it a table? Is it a carpet? Is it a lamp? Is it a chair? Is it a couch? Is it a TV? Is it a mountain? Is it a photo? Is it a painting? Is it a fireplace? So semantic things don't need difficult, elegant memory equipment, but most of our lives are like movies, and that was pointed out by Wilder Penfield back in 1955. He said that our memory is like a cinematographic, a cinema movie, and stories are that way. Music is that way. Identifying a beat to the music, it's not just one image or one sound. It's a case where you don't recognize without having a sequence of notes. Then you suddenly can recognize a sequence and a flow and a beat, things of that nature. So these memories are the basis of stories, tales, if you will. And our memories are either semantic, chairs, tables, couch, stuff like that, or they are like little movies. And it's the little movies that are much more difficult for your brain to store. And they get stored down at the base of the brain, the bottom, in the basement of the brain. That's where they get stored. And the primary part that gets stored is in the seahorse of the brain. Now, if you're going to try and find seahorse of the brain on on the internet, Google it or Wikipedia, you're not going to find it under the term seahorse. You're going to find it under the term hippocampus. So what is hippocampus? Well, it's a Latin term. And if you have a Latin to English dictionary and you look up hippocampus, hippocampus means seahorse. So it's basically, if you want to call it Latin, hippocampus, but if you want to call it English, it's seahorse. Now, is that part of the brain really a seahorse? No, it just kind of looks that way, and that's how the researchers originally found it in the brain. They said, "Oh, that kind of looked like a seahorse," and they named it seahorse. But they didn't want to sound stupid. They changed it to Latin. Oh, it's a hippocampus. And the seahorse is chewing on an almond. And you're going to find almond in the brain, the literature of the brain? No, but you're going to find amygdala. And once again, if you want to know what amygdala means, it's Latin. And in your Latin to English dictionary, amygdala means Almond. So they didn't want to sound like idiots, so they turned these stupid names into Latin. So, but I bet in an hour or so, you're more likely to remember Seahorse and Almond than amygdala and hippocampus. So your stories, the running film of your life during the day, gets stored in the hippocampus, in the seahorse. And you look at the tail of the seahorse, it's curved around. Well, that's because the story is kind of like a tail that spins around. They used to say you spin a yarn. Well, that's typical of what goes into the seahorse is this tail, except the tail is T-A-L-E instead of T-A-I-L. But it's the way it goes through. And the seahorse nibbling on the almond, that almond has flavor, and that gives taste, if you will. It gives a flavor to the story. Well, what kind of flavor is it? Well, it's stress. The purpose of the brain is to protect you from dangers in the external world. And so, as a memory is being stored, it's important to have an idea of how much stress was involved with that story. Was it a happy story or an unhappy story? What was going on? And as a result, things that were happy had zero stress. And on the other hand, things that where your life was in danger, like the sinking of the SS Central America, those are extremely stressful. And that was like 100% stress. And it turns out that your emotions that are tied to a memory are basically how much stress goes into that memory, how much less than ecstasy is it. So that's where the 0% and the 100% get involved. If it's a happy memory, there's basically zero stress involved with it. But if you're on a sinking ship, there's 100% stress. And in the middle, which is what's called cruising speed, it's stressful, and that was pointed out in the Rosetta Stone presentations, and they relate to and the importance of being conscious, being stressful, because if you don't get any sleep, you'll die. And that was pointed out earlier. So in this point, uh, basically being conscious, it's a stressful situation. Even though it's cruising speed, it's not terribly stressful. It is stress. And if you don't sleep, you'll die. So all of this consciousness relates to how much stress, which is a factor related to ecstasy, no stress. And cruising speed is in the middle of the road. It's about 50%. So your story goes from the hippocampus through the almond, the amygdala. It marks it with how much stress goes to that experience. And it's a somatic marker, emotive trace, and hedonic tone. And with that, it gets stored into long-term memory. So the seahorse, the hippocampus, is short-term memory. And then final storage is long-term memory. Now, it's going to be easier to understand these with some examples of failures with the hippocampus, the seahorse, and failures with the amygdala, the almond. And much that science has learned about the brain and how it works has come from damage to the brain, frequently caused by war and disease. Now, we'll shortly be getting into that, but one other idea about the hippocampus being episodic comes from Stephen Rose, neuroscientist researcher. He references a couple of Russian researchers who have found that in the hippocampus in the seahorse, there are neurons that can count and remember. And such ability is basically creating a time track, and it's critical for conceptualizing music or any sequence of events. So that is the important function that we're looking at right now in making decisions and so forth. So emotion is subtractive. And as an experience comes through, how much fear is related or how much stress is related to that memory that's being created. Was there zero stress involved? Uh, was there severe stress? Like, was it a brush with death, or was it cruising speed, sort of middle of the road? So with happiness and euphoria representing 100%, no fear, you subtract 0%, so the net happiness is 100%. So that's ecstasy. But if, say, you're just being vigilant, which is the cruising speed, so 100% happiness, subtract 50%, so your net happiness is 50%. So how do you feel? Well, feel okay. I'm fine. Are you doing cartwheels? Are you ecstatic? Well, no. Are you in sheer terror? Well, no. So you're at cruising speed. You could potentially feel happier. You could potentially feel worse. And most of our lives are spent at cruising speed. That's the default emotion while we are awake and while we are being conscious. We do not think of it as being emotional because it just doesn't seem to register as positive or negative, but it is an emotional state because we know we can feel better and we know we can feel worse. And the importance of this state is it's low energy use, so it conserves energy, and evolution is pressuring us to conserve energy. Now, at the extreme other end, if happiness and euphoria is 100% positive and terror represents dramatic, stark terror and fear at a negative 100%, then you subtract one from the other and your net happiness is 0%. You're not real happy when your ship is sinking. Okay. So why is emotion subtractive? Well, the internal control system represents balance and joy. So that's how well is your body working together. And the external control system, which is what consciousness is part of, that's an imbalanced state and it's stressful. And now you've got two systems. So how are you going to store a memory? Are you going to store some indicator from the ICS, the internal control system, the parasympathetic nervous system? And are you going to also store another indicator for the sympathetic nervous system, the external control system, which indicates balance, imbalance, and stress? So are you going to make two updates to indicate, are you going to have two systems related for the storage of memories? Or are you just going to leverage one, knowing that the internal control system is the optimum, happiness and the internal control system working at maximum harmony within your body is that one? Are you going to have two updates or just one update? And if you rely on the internal control system maintaining any reference to pure joy and happiness, then all you have to do is one update for a memory that indicates how much less than ecstasy is this experience that you're storing as a memory. Well, it looks like evolution has decided you only need to make one update. Two updates are too expensive. You're going to need two systems to doing something. So for efficiency, appears how the brain and evolution has decided to make things work. Okay, what kind of evidence do we have for that? Well, we need to look into the markers. And again, it focuses primarily on two parts, which are the bottleneck. All of your episodes, your stories, your memories, not somatic, but episodic, the ones that rely on a sequence of events, those go through the hippocampus, the seahorse, and the amygdala, the almond. Now, to put a little meat on the bones, some descriptions that show this. We'll be referencing three cases. One is Clive Wearing, second one is Henry Molaison, and finally, the last case is a woman who is just being referred to as SM. And just her initials. For many, many years, Henry Molaison was referred to as HM, which are her initials, his initials, till after his death, when his real name was finally made public. Now, SM, her identity is still being hidden because she's still alive, and she's living fairly normal life, other than her her brain difficulties. But because of her difficulties, is uh, she's very naive and guileless, and so she's sometimes referred to as a Pollyanna. So we'll be referring to those three cases for illustration, starting with Clive Wearing. He was a musicologist, a conductor, a pianist. He was also a tenor, an excellent singer. And he was so well respected. And when Princess Diana and Prince Charles were married, it was Clive Wearing who did all of the music on the radio during the ceremony. So he was extremely well respected and just fabulous. But in 1985, he had uh, an unfortunate disease, herpes simplex virus, which led to encephalitis, and that affected his brain, and he suffered brain damage to the hippocampus, the seahorse. And as the aftermath is, he suffered severe amnesia, and he was unable to form new memories. And he only remembers his wife, as well as retaining some language skills and muscle memory. And that allows him to play intricate piano pieces as well as sight read sheet music. And that gets involved with another part of the brain, which is the cerebellum, which I'm not going to get into today. But basically, the hippocampus is for short-term memory and for new memories. So the process of memory formation is your experience gets stored in the hippocampus, and then later in sequence it gets stored in the brain in long-term memory. So when he had his unfortunate illness, all of his old memories, which were sequential and so forth, were in his long-term memory, and they still worked as they had always worked. The damage with the hippocampus means he just could not acquire any new memories. His old memories were still intact and they still worked. And as a result, after this unfortunate disease that struck him, he was still able to remember old sequences, and he remembered his wife, and he loved his wife dearly, Deborah. And in the references down on the bottom, you can learn more about Clive, but there's a 15-minute episode on YouTube about his life. It's the one that's marked with the hoodoo Q at the end. It's the middle one there. It's only 15 minutes. And you can get a much better idea of what is working, what isn't working. And if his wife is in the room, he's just ecstatic and effusive with his love of his wife. And then after she leaves, just a few seconds later, he's forgotten that she's left the room. And when she comes back in, again, it's as he had never seen her for the past 6 months or a year. And he again is a very effusive and loving. So he has very strong emotions toward her. But he can't create any new memories. As soon as she leaves the room, he's forgotten her. Now, during the videos, there are some excerpts where he will keep track of a concept for as much as a minute, but as soon as he changes subjects, it's gone. Can't remember anything, and because of that, he can't read a book because he can't retain an idea from sentence to sentence to sentence. So episodic storytelling, movies, things of that nature, pretty much are out of his ability. So this underscores the importance of the hippocampus for the storage of new memories in the brain. Now, the second example is a guy named Henry Molaison. And he had an accident with his bicycle, apparently a head injury when he was younger, maybe around 10. And later on, he started developing epileptic seizures as a result. And they got more and more severe. And eventually, in 1953, his attending surgeon suggested removal of both of his hippocampus nodules. There are two, one on each side of the brain, so that's why the plural term hippocampi. And amygdala, again, there are two of those, one on each side, so that's the reason for the plural term amygdalae. And the surgeon removed both hippocampi and both amygdalae in an attempt to cure his seizures. Unfortunately, it did not cure the issue, and the nasty side effect of the surgery was severe amnesia. Back then, in the early 50s, they did not understand how these things function. The anatomists who named those parts of the brain, the hippocampus and amygdala, naming them Seahorse and Almond, obviously the names had nothing to do with the function of those parts of the brain. So they were not well understood in 1953, and the surgeon did not understand the kind of damage that he was causing. But that became clear after the surgery was over, after those parts of the brains were surgically removed. Suddenly, Henry had severe amnesia, basically like Clive Wearing had, and he was unable to create new memories. So that's the second example, and both of those relate to the hippocampus, which is primarily related to episodic. There are cases where some things that are semantic, table, chair, carpet, objects, where the brain seems to allow things to be stored by bypassing these two important modules, the hippocampus and amygdala. But let's go on to the third example. She is known only as SM. Sometimes she's referred to as SM046. And she was basically naive, didn't understand fear. She had no emotional concept of fear. And that's because she was suffering from a disease called Erbach-Wiethe disease. And with that disease, the amygdalae were calcified. And in her case, they were almost completely calcified. And so they were mostly dysfunctional. As a result, there could be no or little indication of fear attached to her memories. And as a result, she was, always happy-go-lucky, and she had no fear in social situations. She would hug people, and she'd come right up to your face and talk to you, not as someone being angry, but someone who just wants to be close to you. I mean, she seemed almost like a delightful person to be around. Unfortunately, she was preyed upon by others who were nefarious, and that is what brought her, and some issues with seizures brought her to see Dr. Damasio, who is the one that supports the somatic marker hypothesis. So her memories are stored with little or no recognition of danger, of fear. So that indicates that it's the amygdala that introduces fear into our memories. And her lack of fear awareness, that also was supported by Stephen Rose in earlier research, but that was done with animals. And in his book, The Conscious Brain, he indicated that the removal of the amygdala can cause the loss of fear and aggressiveness, and it results in tameness and placidity in a number of species, even the notoriously savage ones like the wild rat. So once again, the amygdala is tied to fear and stress, of course, that goes along with fear in our memory storage. All right, so there are three basic researchers coming up with ideas that are basically the same: somatic marker, emotive trace, hedonic tone. And these are how memories are stored. They're marked with a fear factor. Again, these memories are primarily episodic, things that are in a sequence, like a movie. Music is a sequence, it's episodic. And so those things get stored with this negative trace. So the experience, as it's created by all of your senses, it's like a movie. Then, as it's getting stored, it goes into the seahorse, the hippocampus. And then from there, the hippocampus is connected to the amygdala, the almond, which basically samples how much stress is related to this experience. And from there, that amount of stress is attached as a marker or a trace or a tone. And then that is subtractive. No fear, if it's no stress, then it's 0% subtracted. If it's extremely stressful, 100%, it's on you're the verge of death, then it will be 100%. but most of our lives are somewhere in between. Cruising speed is very low emotion, but whatever the amount of stress involved with the experience, that gets marked with the experience and stored into long-term memory. All right. So the question becomes, for the marking, is the memory pleasant, unpleasant, or not memorable and bland? And it turns out that most memories are the last kind. Most of the things that happen in our life are not remembered because they have very low energy, they're low emotion, and as a result, they're easily forgotten. But nonetheless, they are memories, even though they're bland, and that's where rational thought is considered non-emotional, but in reality, it is emotional. It's just very, very, very low emotion. And that gets us back to Elizabeth Duffy's idea, which has been presented earlier in the second presentation, I think the first presentation as well. Between emotion and non-emotion, no clear differentiation can be made. Activation occurs in a continuum from a very low degree to a very high degree. All right. So that's our first foray into decision making. And in the next presentation, this will lead into Gestalt psychology, where basically our emotions rise and fall. They within Gestalt psychology, the terms are progressive formation and destruction of perceptual gestalts. And a gestalt is a whole. The idea of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the whole, there is what's called an emergent property. If you put all the pieces of a car together, suddenly not only do you have the pieces, but now you've got a vehicle that you can drive. And that's where there's an emergent property to the assemblage of the pieces and parts, the way they're put together, the organization. It's the assemblage that forms the emergent properties of a gestalt. So that that will go, that will extend everything that's been presented so far. And together, all of these factors of humanity, all of these fields, everything we do, from music to consciousness, to science, to play, having fun, it all integrates within the emotive energy system. That's why I refer to the emotive energy system as the Rosetta Stone of psychology. So these are just typical ideas that are integrated: theory of evolution, Maslow's humanism, Skinner's behaviorism, Freud's psychodynamic theory, Power's perceptual control theory, and also Bernard Barr's global workspace theory, and many, 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 many more. Most of these ideas are included in the Reignite Your Creativity Psychology of the Creative Mind. It's available as an ebook or as a paperback, and those are available if you want to research or cover this material in more depth.